have the tentacles of the Wagner Group already reached South Africa? We speak to Dr. Bohumil Doboš of Charles University in Prague. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
Doctor, there are rumors that the Wagner Group propaganda division is already operating in South Africa. What can you tell us?
It is extremely likely that they are doing this for quite some time. Right now, the Internet Research Agency of Yevgeny Prigozhin, which is based mainly in St. Petersburg, is operating worldwide, which is something that we have seen already for quite some time right now. There have been some accusations of the interference in the US presidential elections already some 6 years ago, so this is nothing that would be that new. Especially here in Europe, we can see the effects taking place for quite some time. Now, there is an issue how this IRA can be attributed to Wagner, because it seems that they are, even though they are personally connected, it's not part of the same organization. But given the lack of transparency in Russia in general, this is something to be discussed further on, and where we don't have clear evidence. Regarding South Africa, it is quite obvious that the Russian elites has their interest in the outcome of the ongoing general election, that there are some clear connections to African National Congress. Given the historical ties, we can see it recently with some of the speeches given by the political elites in South Africa. And this is something that the Russian elites and the Internet Research Agency will seek to continue to make use of. If African National Congress remains to be the unchallenged leader in South Africa, this is definitely something that Moscow can make use of. Now, the way how the Internet Research Agency work is that they make use of the already existing divisions inside of the society and exacerbate them, meaning that they make use of disputes that might be marginal at the beginning, but thanks to the working of the especially social media, they can turn them into the major battlefields that then help to create some sort of internal chaos or instability that then they make use to propagate their own candidates, which seem to be standing on the right side of the issues, and thus shifting the popular support towards the Russian-backed candidates. Now, how this will be successful is hard to measure. It's hard to measure even in the elections that have already taken place, but there is definitely some presence globally, and it's extremely likely that these efforts will be present in South Africa throughout the upcoming elections as well.
So what capabilities exactly do they have to interfere in elections and to stoke unrest and unhappiness amongst the population?
Like, the main tool that they are using is the promotion of the divisive and pro-Russian narratives through social media, which is basically the easiest thing you can do, create a lot of diverse issues, create lots of trolls, the bots that create the echo chambers where these issues seem to be more important than they are, when they create sort of a fake support to certain causes that then make more and more people join, more and more people care about them, and this way they can divide the society. Especially nowadays with extremely high penetration of social media, this can create a lot of issues. Obviously, then there can be some more direct interference, like monetary support with election campaigns for their selected parties, but this is something that would be more visible, that would be much easier to uncover in case this will be happening. However, this presence on the social media, especially due to the working of them, due to the working of the algorithms, is often harder to spot.
Where else in Africa have you picked up IRA operations?
They are basically present all over the continent. IRA is making use of any openings for them where they can create some pro-Russian, anti-West narratives. We have seen it especially present in conflicts where Wagners are present militarily, places like Central African Republic, like Western Sahel, where not only social media but also operatives on the ground have worked to create some anti-Western sentiments or more precisely strengthen them was obviously due to the colonial legacy. These were always present in there. We have seen these present in Madagascar in 2018, when there were strong indications of operations of Russian agents on the ground that were handing people cash to attend the pro-Russian demonstrations. We have seen attempts to do so prior to the ousting of Omar Bashir in Sudan, where the Russian operatives were creating a media campaign to discredit the anti-Bashir demonstrators as being supported by Israel, being anti-Islamic, burning down some mosques, stuff like that. So we can see these types of operations, like more heavy-handed operations, being present in the conflict zones, but the presence of the social media is basically present all over the continent, but not only in there. We can see the same happening in places like Latin America and Europe, in North America as well.
What's the difference between the modus operandi on the African continent and in the West?
The main difference is the narratives you can use. You always need to target the narratives according to what the specific populations see as an issue. Even though some of the narratives reappear, like, for example, anti-LGBT, homophobic propaganda, which is used everywhere. It's very popular with Prigozhin and Putin. Not sure why, if they have some troubles with their sexuality or whatever, but this seems to be a very popular narrative. However, for example, the anti-colonial narrative is not something that would be very much useful in Europe, but is very much useful in some of the African countries. So this is a difference in the narratives, and obviously this more heavy-handed approach, sending operatives on the ground to set up the demonstrations, to pay the journalists to cover these, is much more visible in Africa or in many African countries than it is in Europe, even though even here we have journalists that are being paid directly from Russia. We know it even after the invasion. However, their impact is much smaller, and the ability of Russia to, for example, finance the pro-Russian demonstrations is also much more limited compared to numerous African countries.
How do you think the propaganda operations have shaped the views of African countries on the West-East conflict?
It's definitely present in some areas in countries like Mali, like Burkina Faso. We have seen that this even strengthened the especially anti-French sentiment, which in the end led to the ousting of the French troops, which deteriorated the security situations in these countries, led to a massive spike in the deaths of the civilian population. But from the information point of view, from the point of view of numerous segments of the societies, this seems as preferable simply because of the narrative has been captured by Russia. In other African countries, the impact is probably lower. We have seen the recent data that covered even South Africa that seemed to portray a picture of vast majority of South African citizens not siding with Russia in the recent aggression against Ukraine. And this is the case even for the voters of the ANC, that in the majority are not on the side of Russia and feel that Ukraine is the party that is being targeted. However, this is not being reflected by the political elite. So the impact might seem strong, but we can see a global shift against Russia that is significantly stronger in Latin America and Africa compared to other parts of the world.
Moving on from Wagner's propaganda operations to its military operations, give us an overview of its military might on the African continent at the moment.
Yeah, so Wagner Group is currently present in two regions mainly. It's the region of Libya, Sudan, so Central Africa, which create a sort of a triangular trade in there. And then they are present in Western Sahel, mainly in Mali, but partially in Burkina Faso as well. In the past, Wagner operatives were also present in Mozambique, but this was a huge failure. Plus, they are present in less significant numbers in other countries as sort of a training, support, etc. But mainly it is the case of the two regions. In case of Mali, the main goal is the protection of the regime in case of the ongoing civil war. After the retreat of the French troops and the ongoing retreat of the United Nations mission, the spike in the civilian deaths is significant. The same goes for the Central African Republic, where Wagner came as a substitute for the French troops with the brutal tactics that Russia usually uses. And this is something that is a pattern of the Russian involvement elsewhere. We have seen it in Syria. We have seen it in Chechnya, when the Russian modus operandi is basically to win the conflict throughout massive escalation, which leads to some successes in the short term. Chechnya seems to be stabilized, but you have huge amount of Chechens fighting against Russia in the Middle East, in Ukraine. So if the state started to collapse, we might see a reappearance of the conflict in there. In Syria, it's a sort of managed instability that was reached through the massive use of weapons against the civilians, use of chemical weapons, stuff like that. And this is basically a modus operandi that is reappearing in Mali, in Central African Republic, when in Mali, the European approach was more to train the local army to be more responsible to the populations, to win the hearts of minds, while the Russian approach is to scare the civilian population into submission, which is never a sustainable effort. When it goes to the Central African Sudan, Libya region, the situation is a little bit more problematic, as in Libya and Sudan, we can currently see an ongoing civil wars where Russia is supporting one side of the conflict, be it Khalifa Haftar in eastern Libya, or RSF under General Hemeti in western Sudan, which creates a sort of a zone where Wagner operatives can conduct their operations, basically landing their weapons in Libya, sending them to Sudan, when they are exchanged for gold that is then transported to Central African Republic, and these minerals are then sold elsewhere. So this creates a sort of a security economic zone that is made use by Wagners or Russia. Part of these profits were definitely used for the financing of the war.
I think people erroneously thought that the failed march on Moscow would affect Wagner's operations in Africa, but that obviously will not be the case.
We still don't know yet. The march on Moscow was something completely ridiculous. It was something we watched amazingly, especially how it worked out. However, it seems that there are some movements against Wagner taking place in Russia. Some of the generals that sided with this mission of Yevgeny Prigozhin to do something, we still are unsure about the ultimate goals of the march, were already put in prison. There are seemingly some changes on the top of the army, on the Ministry of Defense, and Prigozhin himself was sent to Belarus. And now it seems it will be interesting in the weeks to come how this will play out, because one of the possibilities is that Prigozhin will remain in Belarus. He will be focused on supporting the mission in Ukraine. However, this seems unlikely because there is obviously a tension between him and Putin after the events. The other option, which was highlighted by some of the media, was that Prigozhin might focus solely on Africa, which would in the end likely mean that he would have to be removed in there because he won't be personally safe in Belarus or Russia, because stuff happens. We have seen a lot of people falling out the windows, being poisoned, stuff like that. So this is obviously another step that can be taken. Or Prigozhin can be get rid of, and the operations in Africa might be overtaken either by state agencies, the Ministry of Defense, the Armed Forces, or other company. I don't like to use the name private military company because Wagner is not a traditional private military company. It's not legal. Private military companies are inherently illegal in Russia, so they are more of a warlord / mafias groups. So other of such companies can take over the Wagner's operations. We have already seen that some of the other companies have been hiring the ex-Wagners that used to operate in Africa, which would highlight the fact that they are preparing themselves to take over the business model that was established by Wagners. So even though the current reaction seems to be ridiculous, Prigozhin did not march on Moscow. Moscow did not react in any meaningful way. There is something brewing up, and it will be interesting to see how this will play out.
Well, Wagner achieved quite a lot of leverage for Russia in these African countries. Surely Russia would not want to let that go.
Definitely. Even Sergei Lavrov, straight after this incident was over, claimed that Russia will continue with its engagement in Africa. The contracts between Russia and countries like Central African Republic and Mali were not being signed with Wagner directly, but with Russian government, which was also highlighted by the Central African Republic. They cannot be signed with Wagner because Wagner is illegal in Russia, technically. So this would be problematic. But Central African Republic political elites have highlighted this, that they have signed their contracts with Russia. And in case Wagner has to retreat, they are confident that the Russian state will not leave them be and that Russia will remain present. So it seems unlikely that even if the Wagner presence in basically not only Africa but elsewhere will be discontinued, that Russia will leave these areas be altogether. And prior to some total collapse of the Russian political elite, of the Russian state, which might be ongoing but not, we still aren't sure. It's too early to tell. Russia will probably remain active, at least in these two priority regions, and will continue to try to shape the informational environment, which is extremely easy. It's extremely cheap for them. They can do it basically from their offices in St. Petersburg, even though it's not as efficient as to be on the ground, but still you can conduct your activities. So yeah, I would agree with that statement.
What can you tell us about the origins of the Wagner Group and its funding?
Wagner Group itself originated from several other iterations of similar, seemingly private military companies that appeared in Russia in the first decade of the 21st century. And basically Wagner substituted other similar group that operated in Syria after Russia started its engagement, as Russian state wanted to mimic, at least seemingly, the type of operations that the US was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, using contractors for as many operations as possible, simply because you don't lose your own soldiers. You can have some plausible deniability regarding some actions, etc. However, the Wagner Group was not as efficient as it's usually portrayed. There is this famous battle between some couple of hundreds of Wagner groups and Syrian defense forces against the tens of US special operators. I believe it was 2015 around the Euphrates River, where the US did not lose anyone, and there was about 100 killed Russian contractors in this combat. So even though Wagner Group helped to stabilize the al-Assad regime, their efficiency on the battleground is not as prolific as is usually portrayed, which was, for example, visible also in Mozambique later on. This is where Wagner got his credentials and became a preferred operator used by Kremlin in other conflicts where it did not want to engage directly, like Libya, like Central African Republic, etc. Regarding the funding, it seems that the Wagner is partially self-funded through their operations around Africa, especially when they have these licenses on mines, not only in places like Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan, but also Madagascar and elsewhere. Additionally, Putin, after the recent march on Moscow, claimed that the Russian state has been partially funding Wagner, even though after the beginning of the aggression against Ukraine, the Wagner financial scheme helped to finance the aggression itself. So there seemed to be some interconnectedness between the efforts of the Russian state and Wagner, depending who has the upper hand. Financially, one is financing the other.
What about the relationship between Wagner and the oligarchs? Is there one?
Depending which oligarchs, Yevgeny Prigozhin himself is definitely an oligarch, and there have been some incidents of some of the businessmen that make use of these economic schemes. However, the specifics are extremely opaque, so it's unclear who are the real owners of the companies, etc. So definitely the clique around Prigozhin would benefit out of this model, but there is a strong opposition to Prigozhin inside Russia, which will definitely not be part of it. So it's a part of the divide and conquer strategy that is being drafted by Putin to keep in power in Moscow, and definitely part of the elites are making use of the financial schemes, of the financial projects that have been set up across Africa and elsewhere.
Finally, is there anything you would like to add about the actions of violent non-state groups on the African continent?
Problem regarding violent non-state group is that they make use of the weaknesses of the African state and connect it to the Wagner Group. Wagner Group claimed to be helping the state to get rid of these. It's the issue mainly of the CPC in Central African Republic, of JNIM, Islamic State in Mali. However, the problem is that the Wagners are not strengthening the state capacity to fight these groups, meaning that they are protecting the important sites, the mining fields, the capital, the political elites. However, they are not strengthening the state capacity to fight these violent non-state actors, which in the end mean that the regimes are 100% dependent on the Russian backing. They are not creating their own capacity to fight these actors. And the fact that Russia, even though it claims that it supports the sovereignty 100%, etc., is not on the side of the state, can be pretty much visible in Sudan, where Russia is basically backing the independent militias that are tackling the recognized seat of power, meaning that they make use of any of these instabilities. They are actually enhancing the conflicts in which they can thrive, and thus exacerbate the issues that are created by the state weaknesses, the presence of the violent non-state actors. This was extremely visible in Mali. Not to say that the French engagement would be a huge success, but at least there were some stabilization efforts in the southern part of the country. When the Wagner Group came, the conflict heightened up, the amount of violence is increasing, meaning once the Wagner retreats, it is very likely that we will see some sort of collapse of the country that would need to be sorted by someone else. The same goes for Central African Republic. I'm 100% sure that President Ouattara is very much afraid of the Wagner retreating, because this would mean the end of his rule. That would be probably very violent.
Thank you very, very much. That was Dr. Bohumil Doboš of Charles University in Prague in the Czech Republic, talking to us about Wagner's propaganda and military operations in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.